With the newly released GitHub Enterprise Importer, or GEI, migrating to github.com or enterprise managed users has never been easier. In part 1 of this series on GEI, I'll give you an overview of the tool and we will run through a simple demo. Future episodes in this series will dive into GEI in detail, as well as provide tips and tricks for a successful migration. Here we go! Hey y'all, I'm Mickey Gousset, and in today's video, I'm going to give you an overview of our newly released GitHub Enterprise Importer tool for migrating to github.com and/or enterprise managed users. Using this tool, you can migrate your source code and relevant metadata, for example, code reviews and comments. While we publicly launched the tool on June 12th, it has already been used by over 2,000 customers to migrate over 400,000 repositories to GitHub Enterprise Cloud. I've helped several customers with their migrations using this tool. As of launch, the tool supports the following migration paths: Azure DevOps, service, not server, to GitHub Enterprise Cloud, enterprise managed users; GitHub Enterprise Server to GitHub Enterprise Cloud, enterprise managed users; and GitHub Enterprise Cloud to enterprise managed users. And currently, there is a private beta available for migrations from Bitbucket Server and Bitbucket Data Center. One of the nice things about GEI is that it's a self-service tool. You can grab it and start using it without needing anyone from GitHub to do anything. It is a command line interface, or a CLI tool, meaning you run it from a console window. And behind the scenes, it is driven by a fully featured API for advanced automations, giving you even more control and options. There is so much more to talk about, such as how you should go about planning your migration, what does and doesn't migrate, and what are all the different options for using the tool. I plan to cover all of that and more in future videos. For now though, let's go look at how to install and use the tool to perform a simple one repository migration. Okay, let's get to it. So we are going to look at how to migrate a repository from GitHub Enterprise Cloud. So right now I'm in my organization, Mickey Gousset org in GitHub Enterprise Cloud. And we're going to migrate the GitHub Actions presentation repository. And we're going to migrate that over to my enterprise managed users organization, which in this case is called Mickey Gousset-Fabricam. And you can see right now that that repository doesn't exist. If we go back to the repository and look at the repository, you can see that we have releases in the repository, we have multiple branches, we have issues, both open issues and closed issues, as well as open and closed pull requests. Now, the GitHub Enterprise Importer is going to import not just the code, but also a good bit of the metadata. Now, it doesn't migrate all the metadata. We can look in the documentation and it will show us what it does migrate and what it doesn't migrate. But what we should get at least is the code, the branches, the releases, the issues that are both open and closed, as well as the pull requests that are both open and closed. So how do we get started with the GitHub Enterprise Importer? Well, the first thing you need is the GitHub CLI. So if you go to cli.github.com, this is the CLI for working with GitHub directly from your terminal. And there are instructions for installing it on Windows. There are instructions for installing it on different versions of Linux, on Mac. Today, I'm going to be actually using Ubuntu running on Windows Subsystem for Linux for this demo. But everything I show you will also work on Mac and will also work directly on Windows, say from PowerShell. So if I go to my prompt, my terminal, and I type just GH, you can see that I have the CLI installed. Once you have the CLI installed, the next step is to install the GitHub Enterprise Importer extension. Now you can see that if I go to gh extension list that right now I don't have any extensions installed. So I need to install this extension. Well, the extension itself is located at github.com/github/ghgei. So here's the actual extension. It's in a public repository. You can look at the code. You can contribute to the code. And it's got instructions, some basic instructions on how to how to install the extension, how to use the extension, as well as links to documentation, which gives you a lot more detail. So we're going to start off by installing the extension. So if we come back to our terminal, we can type gh extension install, and then we just put the organization and the repository where the extension exists. And that'll take just a moment to run. Then you can see it's installed, and if we do an extension list now, it shows installed and shows we're running version 0.45. With the extension installed, the next step is how do we actually use it? And again, there's lots of documentation online that you can read to explain how to use it. We can also look at the built-in documentation. So if we type gh, let's just clear this. We do ghgei --help. Then we get a list of all the different things that the tool can do. Now, we can migrate individual repositories, we can migrate groups of repositories, we can even migrate an entire organization at once if we want to. But for now, we're going to start off with just migrating a single repository for this demo. So we can see that there is a migrate repo command that invokes the APIs to migrate a repo and the repo data. So let's see how this command works. So if I say gh space gei space migrate -repo -help, then we can see all the different options we can use to call this command. So to migrate a repository, we're going to need to know the source organization where that repository is located and the name of the repository. We're going to need to know the target organization and the target repository that we're wanting to migrate. Then a lot of these switches relate to if you're migrating from server, which we're not migrating from server in this demo, so we'll skip for now. I can have it ignore the releases if I don't want to migrate the releases. And I can even have it set the repository visibility on the target repo. By default, it will be private, but I can have it set to other things if I want to. Now, there are two personal access tokens that I need to make this work. I need a personal access token for accessing the source repository, and I need a personal access token for accessing the target repository. There's multiple ways you can use those. You can either pass them in at the command line, but the better way is to actually set a gh source pat environment variable and then a gh pat environment variable for the target personal access token. So let's go create some personal access tokens. Don't worry, I'm going to have revoked them by the time you actually see this video. And see how we would set those in environment variables, and then see how we can kick this thing off. Now, one of the things you have to know when you go to create these personal access tokens are what rights do you need to give the token. So if we look at the documentation around this, you'll see that depending on what role you have, enterprise owner, organization owner, or a special role, which we'll talk about in a future video called migrator, you need to have the following rights. You need to have repository access, you need to have read org access. In this case, for an organizational owner, you need to have admin org and workflow. So those are going to be the rights that we want to make sure we give on both personal access tokens. So to create the personal access token for the source, I can come up in here and I can say, go to my settings, go to developer settings, go to personal access tokens, and we will generate a new token. So we'll make sure they know it's me. And I'm going to call this my YouTube demo token. And if I remember correctly, I needed to give it repo, I needed to give it workflow, and admin org. Let's verify if there was anything else. Let's go back to the documentation. Read org, repo, admin org, workflow. That all looks good. So repo, there we go. So I can scroll down and I can say generate a token. Now I don't need to authorize this token at this point to access the organization I'm trying to access. So what I'll do is just copy this token and put it over here where I can use it in just a little bit. And as I said, don't worry, I'm going to get rid of that token before you might see it again. And then over in my EMU, I need to do the same thing. So we'll go to my settings. And we'll go to developer settings. Personal access tokens. We'll generate a new token. We will also call this one YouTube demo. And we'll give it repository, workflow, and admin org. We'll generate it. We'll grab the token so that we have it. And in this case, I do need to authorize it against my Fabricam organization. So now I have the two tokens that I need to work with the migration. I need to create some environment variables. Now remember, I'm using Ubuntu for this demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say export gh source pat equals, and I'll give it the source personal access token. And then I'll say export gh pat, and I'll give it the target personal access token. And just because I always like to double check that I did it right, I will prove to myself that the source is correct and the target is correct. So those both look good. So given that, I now want to migrate that single repository. So I'm going to say ghgei migrate repo, and I'll say -- GitHub source org, and the source org is mickeygoose org. The source repo is the GitHub Actions presentation repository. The target org is mickeygoose-fabricam. And the target repo, we'll just give it the same name in this case, GitHub Actions presentation. I could have given it a different name if I wanted to. And let's just do that just to show that we can. We'll call it GitHub Access Presentation Migrated. And then we hit return. And as you can see, because we set those environment variables, we didn't have to pass them in. So therefore, it's going to start migrating that repository. Right now, it has contacted the APIs and said that, hey, we want to queue up a new migration. So what happens is we can actually watch. It's going to give us feedback. Every 10 seconds, it's going to come back and it's going to say, you know, what's happening. Now it's in progress. So now it's started moving the code. So with a small repository like this, it won't take very long. Larger repositories can take longer. There is actually a size limit where the importer doesn't work. Right now, that is a migration file size of around 10 gigabytes. That doesn't mean that's the size of your repository. Your repository could be bigger, but it's just the migration file that's created, which is a zipped up kind of file of the information, has to be 10 gigabytes or less. And if you try to do a migration and that migration file is larger than 10 gigabytes, it will come back and tell you, oh, there's potentially a problem. There are some options that you have if your migration file is larger than the current size that we support, which I'm happy to discuss with you at some point as well. All right, so we're still going, still in progress. I know in some ways this is exciting, about as exciting as watching paint dry, but that is part of it. You'll notice that you've been given an ID here. This is your migration ID. This is this ID right here is what, if there is a problem, support, or let's say you're working with my team doing a migration, I could use that to be able to look up what the problem is with the migration. You can see that the migration has completed successfully. I'm actually given a command that I could run to download all of the logs if I wanted to. But in this case, what I'm just going to do is go over to the migrated. I'm going to go to github.com, mikigusei-fabricam. There we go. And you can see we have the GitHub Actions presentation migrated repository. And if I go into that repository, then you'll notice that I have all my branches. I have all my releases. If I go to issues, you'll notice I have 6 open issues, not 5, and that's because one of those is the migration log itself. And if I look at the migration log, it's an auto-generated issue. This is an issue that automatically gets generated during the migration that has information around the migration. So in this case, you can see it didn't really have any problems. It just extracted it, transformed it, imported it, and we're done. If it had encountered problems, if there had been stuff it couldn't migrate, that would show up here in this log. And of course, we saw on the command line, it also gave us a way to download the more detailed logs if we wanted to see the more detailed logs. But you can see it did migrate my closed issues. My pull requests, it migrated my 2 open and my 59 closed issues. And there's also stuff, though, that it didn't migrate. For example, if we go and look at on the security tab, I have some code scanning alerts. However, if I look in the migrated repository, by default, those code scanning alerts were not migrated. There are switches and options on the migration tool where after you do an initial repository migration, you can migrate those alerts. That was some new functionality that was added. But you do need to look at the documentation to make sure you're aware of what migrates and what doesn't migrate. Now, this was just an overview. This was a very simple example using one repository to migrate from Enterprise Cloud to EMU. If you'll remember, if we look at the help, there's all kind of other options that we have here that we're going to need to dive into, right? For example, what are mannequin users, right? How do we migrate an entire organization? Or how do we migrate multiple repositories in an organization as opposed to doing this one repository at a time? All of that I'm going to answer for you in future videos, but this will at least show you the basics of how the GitHub Enterprise Importer works and put you on the path toward being able to do your migrations. I hope you've enjoyed this overview video on the GitHub Enterprise Importer. If so, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and smash that bell to be notified of my next video. Thanks for watching.